Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us for another episode of I Only Ask Because. Your host, Tony, and my co host, Dr. E. And I'm just going to let Dr. E get us started. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Tony. My question today is, as a culture, are we overly selective in terms of groups we consider labor pools, groups we're willing to hire from? I only ask because recently I saw a clip, a short, where a gentleman was referring to a Stanford University study that talked about how in the United States, if you belong to the African American culture, that you are about as likely as someone from another group with a felony to be hired for a job. And so, of course, being a Stanford study, it breaks it down on a lot of different levels. But where my mind immediately went to was thinking about apprenticeships and how, back in the 1970s, for example, apprenticeship programs were really selective. Like you had to look a certain way, they weren't considering women. You well, where I'm from, you almost had to be from a certain neighborhood, and so the apprenticeships were moderately trained and really high salaries, and so everybody wanted them, and people were kind of shut out of that. So fast forward to the I guess the 2020s, where you have technical schools and 2 year institutions and really some 4 year institutions trying to develop apprenticeship programs because in certain fields we don't have enough employees to fill when the current employees are retiring, for example, or
Yeah.
should they leave or be promoted, whatever. So now the apprenticeship programs are looking for darn near everybody. We want more women, and we want more minoritized groups, and we want. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So there are a few groups that I look at when I think about is business and industry kind of missing the mark by not being open to these groups, or to take it a step further, not actively recruiting from these groups. And so, what comes to mind for me would be just as involved, individuals who are coming out looking for work.
Hmm.
I think of people who are coming out of recovery, for example, with alcohol or drug misuse. How are we funneling those groups, right? So I'm not really on culture today as much as I am just feeling like we have a tendency to overlook certain groups and then have to circle back around and try and get them up to speed and make them appropriate for needs that we kind of really should have seen coming. Adult learners, for example, people getting their high school equivalency. How are we targeting and training those groups? I feel like those groups have been ignored for a while too. So, anyway, that's why I'm asking.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying this. I think there is a reason that we have so much. I think there's a reason that we're falling behind with China, with India, when it comes to just the labor that we get, specifically in tech. And I think it's really just, as you were talking, I was just thinking, like, wow, this is crazy. So people like to say back in the 60s and 70s, like the Democrats have always been, they were the racist party back then. So we all know that the parties basically flipped because what their goals were and what their intentions were kind of didn't go hand in hand once all of a sudden the working class that people were looking out for were the minorities that had been basically discriminated against and marginalized for so long. You still have that, I think, today, but it's on a much smaller scale, and a lot of it is indirect. So it's not like, we're not having separate water fountains and all of that, but we were talking about this earlier. If you see a certain name on a resume, you're like, maybe don't want that because I think I know what kind of household he came from. I think I know that that's not somebody I want working. And the problem with that is you have so many people, and you can see it just with the way the presidents changed. We had Trump in 16, Biden in 20, and then Trump again coming in 24. You have a lot of people who are so worried about keeping other people out and they're not looking in the mirror thinking like, man, I am super, super not qualified to do most of the stuff that I'm asked to do. And I want to bring this up. I had several vehicles basically in the shop that I had to spend several $1,000s on, that after I found out what the fix was, I could have done it better myself. And these are supposed to be professionals that know how to fix cars, that specialize in certain vehicles. So I tell them, hey, this is what's going on with it. They look at me like I don't know what I'm talking about. And I'll look this up on the internet. But then after they fix something, charge me a ton of money, didn't fix my issue, and I'm like, hey, why don't you try doing what I told you to? And they're like, oh yeah, you were right. But before, they were talking to me like an idiot. You just have this, I feel like this American attitude where everyone's worried about keeping their comfortable spot. And as an American, you should be thankful and be blessed for what you have, but you also have to realize that just because you're one of the luckiest people on the planet does not mean that you can just keep everybody else out. And I feel like that's what happened with the apprenticeships, and you're seeing that now where so many people that got college degrees, they got these educations that they can't do anything with because everyone was told, especially in the minority communities, go get your degree so you can be something. Part of that is because nobody knew about apprenticeships, or they just assumed it was still like their generation where we couldn't get apprenticeships. Didn't matter how hard we tried, didn't matter where we looked. No, just you can't have that. And that's why you see so many, I feel like, car mechanics and people that actually run construction, unless they're running their own business. That's why you see so many of them, and they're just so, I don't want to necessarily make it a race thing, but it's just people who have gotten so comfortable with doing very little. And you see that with the current administration, where you have these billionaires that are running the show. And for what? They didn't really do anything to earn it. They got lucky. They didn't work any harder than 90% of Americans. They just stole where they could and held people back where they could. And that's why you're seeing this shortage here. And you have people like Elon Musk, who was so smart in how he did it. I mean, I shouldn't say like call him a genius or anything, but he knew exactly what he was doing when he backed Trump. He knew that he'd get a position in power, that he'd have the upcoming president's ear. But then he could really, after using these voters to get his man in office, he can finally do what he wants to do. He wants a space program. He wants to get people from India, people from China that are actually working, like good at what they do, and bring them over here. And then you have the people that were like, I thought that's why I voted for Trump, to keep them out. No, it was never about you. They just wanted to use you for your vote. And here we are. So saying all that to say, it's just it's a tough situation, because I feel like a lot of people don't realize how we got here. And then going back to your point, we're just kind of stuck where you still have the people that are in positions of power. They don't want to let these people in. But to stay successful and to keep your business going, you're going to have to do that. So you either need to work harder, or you need to just let people who are better than you just take that spot. That's capitalism. That's America.
I mean, I appreciate everything you were saying, and a couple of times, I don't know if you noticed, I was kind of grinning on the verge of laughing, because it's so obvious that it's almost funny, but then it's not funny because I think about how negatively it has the potential to impact our community. And when I say community, I mean global community.
Yep.
But I do want to push back on one of the things you said, because it's a very small thing, but as an educator, it's really important to me. Mm-hmm. When you said that you felt like some of the maneuvering was smart, I would prefer we substitute the word slick.
Yeah.
Because words have power.
Yeah.
And I think that really a smart thing to do is what you said towards the end of your statement, right, which was look at everybody and figure out how what we call the buses seats on the bus, right? So your seat on the bus, in my humble opinion, should be based on the talent or the work ethic or whatever it is you can bring to the table, not what you look like.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like, there's a really, I guess it's a really popular movie now. It's called The 6888, and Tyler Perry produced the movie. It's got some really strong stars in it. But long story short, the movie is about a troop, all female, all African American troop. Um, that I want to say was World War II, but if you know
Yeah.
differently, please correct me. Um, and this troop was basically going to be doing, I think one of the moms who was sending her daughter off was saying, well, all they're going to let you do is cook and clean anyway. You can stay home and do that. Well, none of these people in this troop had any expectation of like going overseas or actually seeing battle or anything like that. But they had this really strong leader who was played by Kerry Washington. And as it turns out, there was you have to see the movie, but again, long story short, um, these women found themselves overseas
Mm-hmm.
trying to do what seemed like an impossible task at the time.
Right.
I don't want to give too much away, but in the end, they ended up being able to accomplish much more than anyone thought they could, including themselves when they went into the situation. Why is that important? Like why how is that relevant to what we're talking about? Because again, we were dividing people by gender, by ethnicity, by all these different really these different factors that should not have made a difference.
Right.
If you notice throughout the course of history, which again is one of the reasons I think just knowing history is so important. Not necessarily studying history, but at least having some cognizance of
Yeah.
this is how we got where we are. Um, but throughout history, we've had, women couldn't vote. Now women can vote. Um, there's a particular voting block that's going to look for their appeal because now they're part of the group that can vote. When women got the right to vote, African American women still didn't have the right to vote. So there's been this long process of, okay, now we'll let you in, now we'll let you in. And I feel like as an overall culture, we hold ourselves back when we do that. It's almost like cutting off your nose to spite your face, which is a really old term. I don't know if you've ever heard it, but it's true. And so most of the groups that have been marginalized over the decades really just wanted an opportunity,
Right.
just like everybody else. And sometimes it puts a bitter taste in your mouth if you've wanted this opportunity and wanted it and been denied for this, been denied for that, and then finally, when there are no other options, they're like, well, okay, you can come on. Many of us in a position where we kind of don't have to do that would definitely decline. And that's your talent right there, because the only people who will be able to say, well, no, thank you, are the people who are in a position to move and be successful somewhere else. And those are not going to be your, wake up at 9 o'clock, but you're supposed to start at 8 type people. Those are going to be your really valuable workers. And then lastly, you made the point about education and how certain people were encouraged to get education that they can't necessarily use right now. And I have my thoughts on that. And as I always say, please fact check me, please come back, because one thing I want to do every day when I wake up is learn something. I love to teach. The only thing I like more than teaching is learning. I will say that for a long period of time, I'd have to say post Reconstruction maybe, we've had this system set up whereby if I am a business owner or if I am in charge of hiring, you can come to my place of business and I can say, well, I really want to hire you. I really want to consider you, but one of our requirements is that you have a fill in the blank. Okay, well, you don't have it. Someone can come behind you that for whatever reason I feel more comfortable with. Maybe we play ball together, or maybe they look like one of my favorite cousins, or whatever it is. And they can come in because I'm the decision maker. I get to say, well, you don't really need that, wink, wink. So multiply that by like a gazillion, and you can figure out why we are where we are. There are an awful lot of people. At one point, I would include myself in that number, and thank goodness I was able to pay back my entire undergraduate student loan. But what I will say is, I did not go to undergraduate school, and my parents didn't encourage me to, so that I could say I did, or so that I could meet nice people, or, that was a strategic career move so that I would not get caught up in a situation where I went someplace and they were like, well, you need a bachelor's degree and you don't have one, so sorry. Um, but the rub on that is it continues to happen. Now 3 degrees in, it continues to happen. And so it's almost like the shell game on the back of the bus, where like the 3 card molly, and you feel that way. You feel it's like an extremely expensive game of 3 card molly. Meanwhile, you have these apprenticeship programs that are just now opening up to, like I said before, previously marginalized groups, because they've run out of people. In the state where I live, I'm very proud to say we started an initiative. I got to work on the front end of this initiative, Drive to 55, where we wanted to bring, as a state, wanted to bring people back in who had some college but no degree or certificate, to be able to grow our labor pool. Because what we realized statistically was that if we depended on the traditional track, elementary school, middle school, high school, and then workforce, we were not going to have enough people in the workforce. Once again, we're behind the 8 ball. We're like, okay, well, we really weren't looking at adult learners before, but seeing as how we're running out of people, why don't we look at them? I propose, why don't we start looking at these groups before we need to? That's how you pipeline.
Yep. Yeah, that reminds me of, and you see it again with China and India. I don't know if you've seen the Bee movie. I think it's like Jerry Seinfeld plays the bee or whatever. But I mean, it's actually how real bees kind of do their thing. But basically, the movie, you're once you're born, you're a bee. You have one day where you decide what job you want, and then you have that job for the rest of your life. And behind that, the idea is, how can I just pick this job and I have to stay with it the rest of my life? But also, what you see is everybody has their like niche. They're like, okay, you're gonna do this, you're gonna do it forever. But everybody has a job that they're good at, that they learn to do, and that they stick with. And there's not anything where it's like, okay, you might take this job, but then, or you go down this path, but you won't have a job at the end of it, or you go down this path and you won't be able to contribute. So that's just kind of what I think of when I think of the United States. We have so many people who go into these, let's say, majors or whatever. They're like, okay, I want to do this. And then they come out in the job field and there aren't any jobs for them. And that's kind of the issue that I think it's not only a cultural issue for certain groups of people in America, but for America as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that's why you have to basically import so many people from other countries, specifically in the STEM fields, because we're not teaching our kids from a young age, hey, this is what you need to do. These are the jobs that we need here. China's doing that. India's doing that. But we don't want them over here. Why don't we just do what they're doing? That's one thing I see in business so often, just in the line of work that I do. If I go to a client or potential client, I say, hey, I have this. Would you all be interested in it? First thing they're going to ask is, well, do you do it for those people over there? Do these people do it? And if I say yes, they'll be like, yeah, we'll take what they're having. Just because it's really that simple. And instead of them, you can just tell that certain people are about success, their goals, and getting their money. And a lot of people who vote a certain way, they say they're about that, but they're really not. Because if you did 5 minutes of research, you would see, oh, really? I don't even know why I'm out here doing what I'm doing. I need to get to work or do something other than putting, political stickers on the back of my bumper. It's just crazy to me.
Well, I don't know. I think that so recently I traveled, and on a flight back there was tornadic activity in the area, and So it was a pretty bumpy flight back. Our oxygen mask did not fall down, but had they fallen down, obviously I would have put one on. I didn't need to
Mm.
because I already had oxygen. Like, how many times a day do you really think about oxygen? I had a physical recently. They put this little thing on my finger and they're like, "Oh, you're taking in 100% oxygen. Good. Thanks for letting me know." Like, you don't think about things often until you really need it. Now, if it's something you're pining for, you really want a new outfit or whatever it is, then that's gonna be on your mind. And whenever you see something that's even slightly resembling what you want, it puts it back on your mind.
Yeah.
But stuff like oxygen, if I'm being honest, I don't even really think about water. Again, unless I'm traveling, because when I'm traveling, water is like the hardest thing to get. Like some clean, water that's not gonna cost you an arm and a leg. Um, so I'm saying all that to say, I think if we boil it all down, what we don't do is really care for one another. I think we have become a really selfish culture. And again, when I'm speaking of culture now, I just mean our country,
Hmm.
possibly globally, but I don't have any frame of reference for that. But what I will say, and I do think I have a pretty good frame of reference for this next comment. You mentioned, in the United States, why don't we do what other countries do and make sure that our children are studying things that will be important for them in the future. And I would like to reference another one of my favorite movies, A Few Good Men, where at one point you have, gosh, well, I think this guy might have been a colonel, whatever, general, where he says, "You can't handle the truth." That is what I heard in my mind when you said, "Why can't we do the same thing basically with our education system?"
Mm.
Um, I don't know where this started, but I'm positive this is where we are. We have systems in place that, okay, we have families that don't want to hear the truth about where their kids are. Again, not to be too specific, but there's statewide tests where if the testing comes out and your school or your kids or your community, your test scores didn't come back where we feel they should be as a nation, for example. And keep in mind, as a nation, we're still a lot lower than some of the other countries you mentioned. But what you get is pushback from parents. You're not holding my kid back, and all these other. It's almost like we're supposed to be on the same team, but we really have such opposing goals that
Hmm.
we're never gonna
Hmm.
win. Does that make sense? Like
Yep.
we're not gonna win. And so one of the reasons is that as an education system, I think we're more about coddling than actually instructing. And that's one part. Another thing you brought up, and I can speak to this personally. I don't know who's at the helm all the time. It is my fault as a student when I was given the advice, do not take typing or keyboarding because if you do, you'll always end up as somebody's secretary. I have to think that that was not an intentional ploy
Yeah.
to ruin my future and my career. I'm sure that that was true at some point in time. Might have been true when it was said to me. It's not true today because with the advent of the personal computer, we if you're not keyboarding, basically you're pecking. And if you're pecking, you're slow. And if you're slow, you're going to fall behind. And that's with anything. But at the time, that sounded like solid career advice for me. So, who's advising our young students? Who's advising the families? Right? A lot of times, students are making decisions about educational choices directly based from what they're hearing at home. So that means this message can't be just for little Johnny when he gets to school. This has to be a almost like a public service announcement. These are the pending careers, a lot of which we don't know.
Yeah.
That's one thing that I think we've learned since we've gotten into the 21st century is that so many, because of the rapid rate at which technology is advancing, there are a lot of jobs that we don't even know what they're going to be. So, what do you
Hmm.
teach somebody if you don't know what's coming? Well, you teach them critical thinking. You teach them core skills. What a huge pet peeve of mine with people hopefully we'll stop calling soft skills. There's nothing soft about having collaboration skills. There's nothing
Yeah.
soft about um, what do they call it? Emotional intelligence. It's not soft about that. Those are core skills that even if you are a NASA qualified engineer, if you don't have those, you're going to have some issues. So, again, not to be on a soapbox, let's stop calling those soft skills. Nothing soft about them. Bottom line, we need to prepare a generation of students for something that we don't even know exists. So that's the job for us. Meanwhile, like you said, in other countries, I feel like they've accepted reality more,
Yeah.
and they're not trying to coddle families. And they're saying, "Hey, your kid needs to perform at this level. If they don't, we'll see them over at somebody's factory or whatever." To me, that would be incentive, really, unless
Hmm.
that's the life you want for your kids. But again, I think as a society, you said it yourself. You're like, well, if you just do 5 minutes of research, well, who's doing that? I feel like we've gotten lazy as a culture as well. And I'd rather you just tell me, preferably what I want to hear. You can tell me what I don't want to hear. I'll probably ignore you. But if you just tell me what I want to hear, then I can feel like, I've got information. I can go on with my day. That is not really how the real world works.
I agree. And I think going back to just how we're brought up here, I think that's one of the big reasons that you see China limiting so much of just social media because a lot of, like you said, it's basically what we're learning at home, and a lot of our kids and even our adults are being raised and thoughts are being formulated based on what they see on the internet. So whether that's with YouTube, what their friends comment on Facebook, what they see on the TV show they watch, all of that stuff, and it's really sad you think about it. All of that is what's really making, I feel like, today's generation. Whereas back in the day, you didn't have so many outside influences that were really just on you 24/7. Maybe there's a guy down the street that you saw was driving a Porsche and he was a drug dealer, but that wasn't in your ear as much as, I would hope not at least, as your mother saying, "Let me find out that you're dealing drugs and you're dead." And you
That's a
see,
perfect example. Actually, it's almost like, have you been reading my diary? But yes, continue.
so I just think that's kind of what our issue is, and that's why you have so many behavioral problems and people are diagnosing their kids with all this stuff. And you have to think, how did you raise them? How did you bring them up? Did you always have them on a phone? Did you always have them on a tablet? Did you always have them outside? It could be some things that help. It could be some things that hurt. But those are things that you have to really focus on. And again, going back to what I said earlier, I feel like so many people don't hold accountability for themselves and they don't feel like they have to prove themselves. That's the biggest thing that you're seeing with a lot of these other countries is we're not just importing the Indians and the Chinese because we like them. They're showing that they're much better at these jobs than us. And that's something that I did see Elon Musk said a couple weeks ago when apparently he had just found out that so many of these people that were right-wing extremists were racist, so he says.
What?
But there was there's just so much, like he said, there was like I guess somebody posted this and he retweeted or whatever, but there was like a right and a tech right, and that's really what you're seeing here. And I don't think either one of those sides is necessarily correct. I don't think anybody on the left is 100% correct, but I think it is interesting that you're able to point that out, and yet you put over what $200 million toward this candidate. You didn't know that he was a right, not a tech right, or a lot of the people that voted for him were just right, not tech right. So my point being, we have to really, again, look in the mirror and hold accountability for ourselves. We can't be mad that everyone else is better than us. And you see a lot of that just in the workforce. People are jealous of you because you're better at your job than they are at their job. Sometimes you just have to work harder. Your bar shouldn't be, all right, I'm giving 20% and then somebody else is giving 100. I don't like that. Instead of giving 100 or even double my 20%, I'm going to see if I can get rid of them or get them to work at 10%. It's silly to me. And again, people wonder why we're falling behind to these other countries in terms of education, in terms of technology. There's a reason that literally the president had to put an initiative forward so that we could build our own chips because everyone does it better than we do. Yet we use most of the technology. That doesn't make any sense. but everybody wants to make this equivalence to natural gas. We get all of our fuel from other countries, and they're just now like, oh, well, why don't we use a natural gas at home? I mean, it just depends how you want to look at it. But if you see one thing, you got to see it all. So,
Yeah, I do think that we struggle with that. I think that we struggle with a lot of things as a global society and as a country, which is primarily what we're talking about here. Um, I have acquaintances. I don't know that I would call them friends, but I have acquaintances who are not shy about sharing their biases with me. And more often than not, they'll share biases about marginalized groups that I belong to, because I clearly belong to more than a couple. And their out is always, but you're different. And the thing of it is, I'm really familiar with, I would have to say, most of the marginalized groups that I am a part of. And I would have to vehemently push back on that. I'm like most of the people I know, um, in one way, shape, or form. So I'm not special. What's special is you've had a chance to build a relationship with me, and you still have in your mind all of these false ideas about cultures that I represent. And I think that the closer we can get as people to, I know you for who you are, not for who you represent in my mind based on movies I used to watch about um, dusty people from the country or whatever. Like, you are a person. I think it is a gift. I think it's wonderful that I can learn about a background that I had no information about, without leaving the city where I live. I mean, we all can travel over to other countries or whatever, but to be able to just meet somebody and shake hands with them and listen to their story and look at different ways that we are different, but our stories enhance one another. And I feel like that's what it's all about. I think so many of us, though, are guarded for whatever reason. And if you cannot break through that relational barrier, then what we're going to do as a culture is continue to spin our wheels.
yeah.
Um, I don't believe that the majority of people who voted for someone who I see as amoral, and this is my opinion. I'm not speaking for any of the groups I belong to. Um, I don't think that people missed that, and the reason I don't think they missed it is because it's like pushed in your face.
Yeah.
It's not like I'm gonna be over here and be a sneak racist or, um, you know, uh, a sneak gender freak or whatever you want to call it. Like, I'm telling you, this is who I am. And I'm banking on the fact that somewhere deep down inside, you're going to be able to relate to this. That's an issue for this country. And I'm going to go ahead and use the R word, even though I understand it's becoming less and less legal. But our country has a race problem. It's like a cancer, and you can cut it out of one place, but if you don't eradicate it completely, it is going to keep coming back. It's almost like whack-a-mole. If you're familiar with that game, like, it's going to pop up here, you can beat it down, but it's going to pop up here. What you need to do is unscrew the game and pull all the moles out, and do you know what I'm saying? Fill in all the holes,
Yeah.
and now we won't have that to worry about. And it's just sad because you can look at, I guess, our racial hierarchy in this culture, and you can say, well, it's okay because I'm at the top. Kind of not, though, because it's a circle, and it's a rotating circle.
Yep.
Now, you may have a pinnacle, a point where this very, very, very tiny group, I believe we've been using the term 1%, is not going on that rotating wheel, but the rest of us kind of are.
Yeah.
And so it's really short-sighted. Again, just know your history, learn your history. I want to, when there are women's groups marching, I want to be part of those groups. At the same time, when there's a Black Lives Matter group marching, for example, I want the same support and representation from people I supported in those groups that didn't necessarily look like me or my relatives. I don't think that we're there yet, but I do think that that's a place where we need to go. I think we need to stop raising our children um, with biases that they weren't born with. I feel like that will go a long way as well. But the first thing you have to do is look at yourself. They teach you this, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, for example. You have to admit that there's an issue. We don't want to admit that there's an issue in this country with race and bias. And until we admit it, we're not going to be able to even take the first step to fix it.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest issues with that is I think so many people are just defensive in their own biases. I know I have biases. I know I have issues. It's like going to your counselor. You have to be 100% honest with what's going on. You can't just pull up a story in your head and you're basically lying to yourself. And I feel like that's what so many people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel if most of us admitted the issues that we were having, even to, let's say, a spouse or whatever, like, hey, I really don't like your hair this way. Or I really don't like that you don't put on makeup before we go out or whatever. A lot of the times you might open up a dialogue of some sort where it's like, you know what? Yeah, I'm tired of not wearing makeup either. I just thought you didn't care, or I thought you didn't like me with makeup. And a lot of this, there's so much of us thinking for someone else instead of actually talking to these people or thinking logically. Like we always talk about the discussion, if like certain people are scared that if another group of people had a fair shot at what they have, they would treat them like they did back during the slavery days. And if you actually talk to most people that are around today that are part of that group, they just want their chance to be successful based on their work ethic, based on their talent, so on and so forth. And no one's really out here trying to get revenge for whatever reason. But then it also kind of makes you upset because when you bring up reparations, the same people are talking more about what's happening for somebody else instead of what's happening for themselves. Maybe you should see about getting yourself some reparation. Don't worry about what I have going on over here. And it's just it's a slap in the face because as a society, we should care more about each other, like you said earlier. And I'm saying this for black people, for Americans, for really anybody on the planet, because at the same time, we're all pretty much, we have more similarities than we do differences. We all have, for the most part, the same number of chromosomes. We have blood types that are different, but it's all red, just there's so much that we have in common, but we're always worried about our differences that are usually just, they don't matter. Like it shouldn't matter if you're this color. It shouldn't matter if you want to do this to yourself. Now, I feel like the moment that starts maybe impeding on what I have going on, I should speak up on it. But for the most part, if I see somebody else winning, I'm not really worrying about making sure that they lose as much as it's like, I want to win too. How can I win? Can you at least show me or teach me? But I'm not going to be mad at somebody else for winning, especially if they're putting in the work. I see they have the talent. So,
Actually, I'm not sure I ever looked at it that way before. You made a statement, we're more alike than different. I'm definitely aware of that. And I think of religion more than anything. Um, what I may have just realized as you were speaking is it absolutely matters that we find differences. But I think it matters more for the powers that be or the people who want control because I'll give you an example. Um, I'm from Chicago. I'm very proud to originally be from Chicago. And we have a football team, an NFL team, the Chicago Bears. Now, am I proud to be a Chicago Bears fan? Most Sundays, no. Because most Sundays, as a team, for as long as I can remember, they do just the nuttiest things. Like you can talk to a real sports commentator, which I am not, and you will hear the same type of, oh my goodness, what are the Bears going to do this time to lose the game? That type of situation. But I'm a loyal fan because of my affiliation with the city more than anything. Um, and I'll always have 1985, but that's a whole nother story. But anyway, there's a team. Our biggest rival, I would say, is probably the Green Bay Packers. Um, and it's a big rivalry.
Yeah.
I have a relative, a close relative, whose only son is a Green Bay Packers fan, and of course, this relative is a huge Chicago Bears fan. And that has always just been a point of contention. I really do feel sorry for him and everything, but I do think as an American citizen, it should be your right to be a fan of whatever, NFL team you want. Where am I going with that? Say, for example, there's a Sunday game, and it is between the Chicago Bears and the Green Bay Packers. When all of the team members hit the field, they all have on exactly the same thing. There are no Bears uniforms. There are no Green Bay Packers uniforms. How in the world are we going to figure out who we're actually rooting for? We don't recognize that, right? Because like I would recognize Caleb Williams, for example, but nope, you can't see any features of any of the players. All you see is everybody has on the exact same uniform. How do you know who to root for? So, zooming out in the main scheme of things, we have to be separated, because if we all come together, how are we going to be controlled that way? What am I going to hate about you if we're exactly the same? Right? So maybe it won't matter, but sometimes it will. In sororities, for example, and there's a group called the Divine Nine, and it's basically the nine primarily African American sororities. People would have heard of Alpha Kappa Alpha and Delta Sigma Theta and Alpha Phi Alpha, and there are more, but there are differences in the sororities, but as a group, the Divine Nine stick together theoretically, have each other's backs, will do things together. That's really kind of what we want. I'm not saying that we need a homogenous society where everybody's the same. What I'm saying is there needs to be a level of goodwill that if there is a slight difference I'm sitting here now with someone of an entirely different gender. So yeah, that's a big difference. So it would matter if there was leadership that said, hey, men are that's a no-go. Men suck. We don't like men. We're going to do everything we can to annihilate all the men. I'm probably not going to be as incentivized to relate to you, because right. Let's face it, you're on your way out, right? So, and I'm being a little bit silly, but I do feel like we live in a culture where people are almost forced to take a side. And I think that's just so unhealthy. It's so unhealthy for all of us. Just open your eyes and see when you're being taken advantage of. Like, to me, that's step one. You're not going to come into my home and make me hate one of my children. Like, you're not going to get a chance to do that. But I think when we zoom out and in the workplace, for example, and I've seen this happen in toxic work environments where you may have leadership, official leadership, or you might have that unofficial leader that everybody listens to and kind of follows behind. And if there's something they want, they can create division where division didn't exist before. And I've just never seen that. Sometimes it ends well for one person or for a small interest, but I've never seen it end well for an entire organization. And so I think as a country, we really somebody has to step forward and say, hey, that's nonsense. What they're talking about there is nonsense. They're trying to line their pockets. Not mad at them for that, but they should not be able to do it on the backs of hardworking people. Like something like that. I feel that's the way we need to go.
Well, going off of that, I feel like the Divine Nine is a good example for the next thing that I was going to say. Basically going off that point, I feel like people don't realize why a lot of groups come together, and a lot of the time it's because they couldn't go anywhere else. The reason that the Divine Nine and those kind of sororities existed is because, heck, at that point in time when those groups were created, they couldn't really go anywhere else because the other groups wouldn't have them. And I think about the issues with people are always talking about how come the Black Panthers did this, how come these people did that. Well, everyone else was just trying to live their normal lives, but they couldn't. So they needed their own form, their own collective, so that they could come together and make something happen for themselves. And I think about what's that place called? Was it Oklahoma? I'm having a brain fart now. Where they basically was it Black Wall Street or something?
Tulsa.
Tulsa, yeah. And they had that whole issue going on.
That's
over
only
there.
one. There's several. There's some in Tennessee too, but continue. Yes.
So basically, that whole Tulsa massacre, I think about that quite often because that really goes to show why a lot of people, especially for those of you that are listening, that are like, how come black people feel a certain way? How come minorities feel a certain way? This is one of the reasons. They couldn't get wealth the normal way, the typical way, by doing what they were supposed to do. So they had to basically do it themselves, start from scratch. And they basically were like, okay, if they want us to leave them alone and do our own thing and they don't want to include us, we'll do our own thing. And then these people were like, no, you can't have that. So they basically went down there and pillaged, looted, killed just because they didn't like what they had. And you see this in so many other instances as well. I think about...
Before you go off topic, though, a question for the times. I think it's very, very relevant for the times we're living in now.
Right.
If it wasn't economic, what was it? That's a rhetorical question. Feel free to carry on. But again, if it wasn't economic, what was the issue? Shh. Okay.
Well, going off of that, I think it's a little bit of both because, again, what I was saying with that, and I'm glad you put that in front, these people were basically jealous that these people had all this going for them despite the odds, despite all the odds being against them, despite there being so much pushback from them being successful. So that makes it even worse. And you see that with bullying a lot of the times. There'll be somebody at school and the bully wants the person that they're bullying to fight back. They want them to yell at them. They want them to fight so that they can basically know that they got to them. So when those people are ignoring the bully, a lot of the times, all that does is make the bully try harder. Mm-hmm. They're like, wow, they don't even care that I'm out there trying to get them riled up.
You said at school?
Anywhere.
At work too, yeah.
Yeah, okay. I mean, heck, you be driving out on the road, I don't know.
Right.
This stuff's crazy. But that's just what you see in, again, today's world. And that's the issue that I feel like so many people don't, again, like you said, this is why you need to know your history. So many people don't realize that all of this is connected. And the reason that we say these things, that it has to be more than just economics, there has to be some other thing involved, is because we've seen that throughout history. Going back before slavery, you can even see that in other countries. Like back in whatever wars there were in the 1200s, 1300s, there's always been something where even religion, something has to divide us. And if they're unaffected and they're living their own life and I'm trying to get them riled up, I'm trying to fight them, that only makes me want to fight them harder. And that's really what you're seeing today. And you are seeing this with a lot of supporters of Donald Trump. And you even saw this with a lot of Biden supporters, where a lot of people went out and voted, not just because of their party, but because they didn't like anything that this side stood for. And you saw this with basically going from an Obama presidency to a Biden presidency, where Obama, I mean, the economy was doing relatively well. There was a big hole that had to be dug out of, but it was basically however many months of job growth there were, it was going up, 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 and then you still were like, let's go this way.
No, that's typical under Democratic leadership. Again, fact check me. The economy is typically stronger, and the gap between the wealthy and middle to lower class is typically smaller under Democrat leadership. But again, that's a fact that a lot of people don't want to hear because, and I respectfully disagree with part of what you said, I don't think it's economic at all. I think that as a culture, once again, we have fallen into a scarcity mindset as opposed to an abundance mindset. Because who's counting the beans? Who said there'll only be enough beans for this type of person, but not this type of person? Like, where did that even come from? You have people who want to talk about this is economic for me, that if their life depended on it, couldn't count to 20. So you are not going to sit in my face and say, well, this is all about economics, because it's not. Because if you and I are at the same economic level, you ought to know what I know, and that is when there's a Democrat in the White House, and I don't really care which Democrat you want to refer to, the economy will be stronger, the jobs outlook is better, and the gap, and this is real important, the gap between the wealthiest Americans and the middle to lower class, economically speaking, Americans is the smallest. It tends to shrink under Democratic leadership and expand under Republican leadership.
Well,
Um,
I wanna push back on that. Do you think that slavery was economic, or do you think that was all race as well?
I think that slavery, if you're talking about the shadow slavery, where as a country, because it's kind of hard to delineate. I think a lot of times we like to talk about slavery like in the United States, but slavery, even the United States, slavery didn't begin in the United States,
Right.
right? So you had the European interest in going to different places and taking not just people but land. So there's a pattern there, and I'm not trying to not answer your question. I mean, slavery, the way it was done in the United States, was absolutely economic. I will say that, right? And I will always say that. Um, the reason that there was a separation in terms of, going down line, okay, so the slaves are just going to be African. We might have a few white slaves sprinkled in here and there. We're going to have indentured servitude. We're going to have Jim Crow. Now, Jim Crow, as you move away from the original economics of coming, stealing somebody else's land, pushing them off into a corner of their land, once they've taught you how to till their land, and bringing free labor over to do the work that you've been taught how to do by the people whose land you just stole. Like, that's definitely economic, but at the same time, you're already noticing differences in terms of culture and racial ethnicity. You're already
Yeah.
noticing that. And so, again, if you're playing a zero sum game where you feel like there's a scarcity model here, then of course you don't want to share with. If you already have the marbles, what's the incentive for you to share the marbles if you feel like there are more players than there are available marbles? But that's a mind game.
Yeah.
So again, you can say something is economic. Like right now, I can just say, all right, well, I'm about to rob you of your wallet and everything. That's economic, right? But I'm going to take advantage of the situation that we're in now. I am not going to go to, what is it, 920, the jail, the
Yeah.
around the corner, whatever, and walk in there and start telling the sheriff's deputies and the inmates that I'm about to take your wallet. Do you know what I mean? So it's not that I have this affinity for people who are in lockup. It's that I feel like if I got to take anybody's wallet, and I don't think I could take you, I am being silly, but I feel like if I could take anybody's wallet,
Right.
I'd rather at least try to get yours. And so that's how the economic piece kind of morphs into the what I want to say, bias piece. Right. So I have to have a bias. I have to have a prejudice against some group because there's not enough for everybody. What if we realize that there is enough for everybody? What if we realize there would probably be more if everyone was allowed to contribute at an equivalent rate? What if that's the real truth?
Well, do you see that? I guess you could look at it two different ways, because I was going to bring up I guess the prison, just the overall justice system in terms of how we put certain people in jail more often than not, and then these people can't afford to get out, and then they end up basically working in jailhouse situations and working themselves to death, to the bone. But then I also just thought about, I guess, the hierarchy of our CEOs, and you can even talk about the more recent assassination of the United Health CEO, where you have so many people, I should say a small number of people that are in power, that they're holding all the marbles, that are basically controlling indirectly, but I feel like almost directly, everyone else. And you can see this where if Jeff Bezos does something or if Mark Zuckerberg does something, all of a sudden half of the Americans that hold their stocks either lose value or gain value based on nothing that they did, based on really nothing that has to do with the overall economics of the company other than what this one person who is a multi-billionaire said. It's just it's really mind-boggling if you really think about it, you know?
If you really think about it. And I guess to bring everything together, I feel like the only thing that is going to help us as a global society is thinking. Now, you have some of us who I would not call Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos necessarily slick based on what I know about them. I feel like with them we might be able to reinsert the term smart. It's possible to be both. I think that's another. Issue that we struggle through as a nation is we think everything has to be either or. Like you mentioned earlier, well, what do Democrats stand for? I mean, I consider myself by and large a Democrat. I have voted for Republicans throughout my life, but I consider myself a Democrat. And as a Democrat, what do I stand for? I feel like I can stand for fairness and fiscal responsibility at the same time. And I'm not trying to brag, but check my credit score. That's representative of fiscal responsibility. At the same time, I do not think it is fair to take social programs from certain groups because if you go back far enough, you will also find that in my what they say dossier or whatever, you will find food stamps, you will find Head Start programs, you can find all of that, and yet I'm sitting here today as what can be considered a marginally successful citizen. So what I'm saying is you don't have to be either or. You don't have to choose between well we're fiscally responsible or we're pro life. I'm pro life too. I'm pro choice. Both of those can be true at the same time. You're not going to get more respect from me because you're air quotes pro life but anti choice. Now we have a philosophical difference that that's kind of like drawing a line in the sand, but we can all be pro life, right? I'm not pro. I have friends who are pro life to the point where they won't wear leather, they won't eat fish, because they want all the fishies to live and everything. So there are definitely levels. This is a continuum, but if you try to convince me that you cannot have a heart for society unless it's a portion of society that's making you money, I take issue with that. I think that's morally deficient.
Fair enough. Well, I think that's a good place to end it for today. I want to thank y'all for watching another episode of I Only Ask Because. We will catch you very soon. Thanks for watching.
Peace.